On April 4, 2007, April Jones was born to Coral and Paul. She quickly became the cherished center of her family's world, a bright and joyful child. Early on, it was determined that she had cerebral palsy and needed daily medication. Despite this challenge, she embraced life with boundless enthusiasm, spreading happiness wherever she went. Her family said she ruled the roost with a cheeky nature whilst also being kind and loving. She loved the outdoors and would often be out riding her bike with her friends. She was also a hard worker in school and was popular amongst her classmates and teachers. On September 30th, 2012, April received a glowing report about how well she was progressing in primary school. Due to having such a fantastic school report the previous day, April was allowed to have some extra time to play outside. April was out playing with her friends near her home on the Brinnegog estate. At 7:20, a Land Rover was seen driving away from Mucklintith at speed. Just 9 minutes later, a frantic 999 call is made. The 999 dispatcher wasted no time by deploying police straight away, and within 8 minutes the first officer had arrived on scene. She spoke to a witness, April's 7-year-old friend, who she had been out with. She was able to provide a brief description. The man who had taken April had brown hair, a beard, blue or green eyes, and was wearing a green jacket or jumper, jeans, and trainers. She also described the vehicle, and one thing immediately stood out to investigators. Her friends said that April had got into the driver's side door, meaning the car steering wheel must have been on the left-hand side of the car, when most cars in the United Kingdom will have the steering wheel on the right. Following this information, a critical incident was launched by the police. As it was an alleged abduction, the police needed to pursue as many lines of inquiry as possible to try and ascertain exactly where April was, knowing time was of the essence. That day had started like any other. April's older sister described it as being a normal day. April had gone to her swimming lesson as usual and then skipped out of the changing rooms to head home. Despite it being October, the sun was out, and it was a nice, warm evening. April's older sister had gone to the youth club, when at around 7:30 p.m., she received a frantic phone call from her mother, screaming down the phone that April was gone. As the sun started to set, panic began to escalate. The response from the community was massive and immediate. As news started to spread on social media that April was missing, people began to come out of their homes to try and assist in any way they could and show support to the Jones family. But this made door-to-door inquiries for the police incredibly difficult, as so many weren't at their addresses, and officers were only able to ask them questions once they returned. When her older sister arrived home from the youth club, she was hoping that April would be home by now. Instead, her distraught mother was out looking for her and police were combing the area. As the search efforts continued to mount, the media became aware that a 5-year-old girl had allegedly been abducted. The eyes of the country were fixated on the small little Welsh community as it had been rocked by something so out of the ordinary. By 10:30 p.m., the police had put out an update saying they were increasingly concerned for April and were appealing for any information that could help find her. 100 of local volunteers gathered to join in the search after the news started to spread on Twitter and Facebook. Also high on the priority for the police was helping to support her devastated family. Police revealed more information about the circumstances of April's disappearance and said she was last seen wearing a purple coat and her school polo top. Refuse collection was suspended as workers joined in the hunt too. Hour by hour, more people came out to help with the search, culminating in more than 100 local residents. The town, with a population of just over 2,000, was inundated with volunteers, with some traveling from South Wales and the north of England. Police said they wanted to make sure that search volunteers were used in a coordinated and effective way. April's family weren't allowed to take part in the searches in case they came across something, so the local community stepped up to help. One problem the search teams immediately ran into was the terrain. The extensive countryside, mountains, gorges, streams, waterfalls, and uneven ground made it an incredibly difficult place to search. There were slate mines in the area too, and all of these factors mixed with the rain presented a huge challenge for those trying to find April. An area of more than 60 square kilometers was searched, and there were more than 300 specific search areas. The police knew that if April had been abducted by a stranger, every second was vital to try and find her safe and well. 8 hours on from the initial 999 call being made, the police and community were still out searching, trying to find April Jones. 120 search officers were out and searched through the night. The morning after she had gone missing, they decided to activate the Child Rescue Alert, which puts on notice all police forces up and down the United Kingdom to be on the lookout for any unusual sightings of individuals who fit the description of April Jones and the person who had allegedly abducted her. Information was being distributed to other forces, including descriptions of both April and the alleged abductor, as well as the car her friends saw her getting into. This was the first time the Child Rescue Alert had been triggered nationwide. It had now been 14 hours since she had last been seen, and there was still no sighting of the missing 5-year-old. Missing posters started to go up around the area, and police began to set up roadblocks to stop vehicles. As the investigation continued escalating, the police force found themselves under mounting pressure from the media to release more information. Press conferences were being held every few hours, and sometimes journalists were given very little notice that they were about to take place. As the search continued, it was the task of Andy John, the detective superintendent, to try and find April's alleged abductor. After the friend of April had been allowed to rest, the police went back to try and get a more detailed description of exactly what she had seen when April went missing. It became clear that April had got into the vehicle with the assistance of the person driving, but it wasn't clear whether or not she knew them. Due to April having cerebral palsy, she wouldn't have been able to get into the car unaided. During the morning of October 2nd, just one day after April had gone missing, the information continued to come through, and it all started to point to one individual. A local man named Mark Bridger. He wasn't someone who was known to local police. They received information that Mark Bridger and his vehicle had been in the area around the time the abduction was thought to have taken place. What immediately caught their eye about his vehicle was that it was a left-hand drive, just like April's friend had described. There had been information to suggest that Mark Bridger had actually been part of the search party that was out looking for April. More units were deployed, and a police helicopter was used to try and find him. They had also received information about 4 potential addresses where he could have been staying. Officers went to the properties simultaneously 20 hours after she had been reported missing, but could find no trace of April Jones or Mark Bridger. When they pulled up outside one of the properties, a cottage called Mount Pleasant, at 3:03 in the afternoon, there were no vehicles at the house. An investigator went inside and called out April's name. There was no response. Bridget had only moved into Mount Pleasant 5 weeks before. At 4:30 p.m., the police made an announcement. Mark Bridger had been arrested. Police gave details of the arrest, saying he was detained while walking his dog along the side of the road after being spotted by the police helicopter at 10:42, a couple of miles away from where April had lived. Not once did he lift his gaze to look up at the police helicopter that was circling above him. He had also attempted to alter his appearance by cutting his hair and shaving off his beard. It was about 30 minutes later that Bridget was spotted by a patrol car. After confirming his name to the officer, Bridget turned and said, "I know what this is all about." The police constable asked him, "Where is she?" Bridget replied, "It was an accident. I crushed her with my car. I don't know where she is." He was immediately arrested. Officers described him as being an emotional wreck. Despite being told he didn't have to say anything, Bridger said he needed to talk. "I've been looking for her all night and today on foot because my vehicle is in the garage. It is a left-hand drive Land Rover Discovery. I didn't abduct her. I did my best to revive her. I panicked. I didn't even know until this morning who she was until I saw the television. I just wish I knew what I'd done to her, where I put her. I want to say sorry to the family. There was no life in her, no response, no breath, no response in her eyes. She was just on the seat. I tried to revive her. I would not have dumped her. She is a human being." He was transferred to Everest with police headquarters. The station was shut down to all other prisoners to ensure that the teams could be properly housed there and focus completely on the investigation. Following his arrest, Coral made an emotional plea to the public for their help to try and find April. Alongside Detective Superintendent Reg Bevan, Police said the overnight search involving 40 trained police officers, dog handlers, and mountain rescue teams yielded no news on April's whereabouts. They thanked the public for their efforts, but warned of the challenging conditions. Police later revealed the operation had been unprecedented in the UK in terms of scale and terrain. Neighboring forces and specialist teams were helping with a focus on over 20 scenes around the area. The operation led to 600 messages from the public to the police, and a search involved 100 mountain rescue volunteers, 100 police specialist searchers, as well as Coast Guards and the RNLI. It was soon time for the police to start questioning their prime suspect, father of 6, Mark Bridger. Shortly after his interview began, he elaborated further about what he had said upon being arrested. He told the officer that April was dead. He said he had run her over, knocking her off her bike, causing her significant injuries. He said in a state of panic, he had put her into the car and then tried to administer CPR, which had failed. He then said he drove off with April in the vehicle. Bridges stated he then lost his memory and wasn't able to tell investigators where April now was. He claimed he was drunk and could not recall what he had done with April's body, but he was sure he had put her somewhere safe. The police made the decision to not release this information immediately, as they needed to verify exactly what was true and whether or not Mark Bridger was being completely honest. Now that Mark Bridger had been arrested, police and crime scene examiners were able to secure his home and conduct a thorough search of the premises to try and uncover any clues as to exactly what had happened to April. Upon going into his home, the stench of detergent and cleaning products was immediately apparent, and it was unusually hot, indicating there had been a roaring fire in the living room fireplace very recently. On the footage taken of Bridget by the police helicopter, a plume of smoke could be seen rising through the chimney from the fireplace of his home. But despite the best efforts of investigators, there was no sign of April either in the property or any of the surrounding areas. Andy John made the decision to meet with the family of April Jones on the evening of October 2nd to disclose the new information that had come to light. They were absolutely devastated by the news that their beloved April was now most likely never coming home. Throughout his interviews, when challenged with the evidence that had been gathered, he would be emotional and unpredictable. Officers believed these emotions were not genuine and pointed to him being both a fantasist and a liar. Mark Bridges' confession that she was now dead left those on the force devastated. They'd worked through the night through increasingly difficult conditions, clinging on to any small chance that she might still be alive. April's older sister said that while the name Mark Bridger meant nothing to her, as soon as she saw his face on the news, she recognized him. She often saw him out and about, and he used to live not far from them. As the investigation into the disappearance of April Jones moved into its third day, the police still needed to prove that Mark Bridger had murdered her. The investigating officers needed to establish any contact he might have had with April during the abduction and obtain any forensic evidence they could. When the police seized his vehicle, they could find no evidence of a road traffic collision and no evidence that the vehicle had struck anybody. Contrary to Bridges' account of April being seriously injured when he put her into the car, forensics could find no blood or traces of blood inside the vehicle. This solidified investigators' thoughts further that Mark Bridges' story of accidentally knocking her off her bike was nothing more than a calculated cover-up of a far more sinister turn of events. As the forensic examination of the car turned up nothing, they turned their attention back to the house where they believed April had been attacked. They were able to find traces of April's blood inside the home, indicating she had suffered significant injuries at the property. They removed what was left in the fire pit in the living room and were able to find 17 fragments of her skull and 1 fragment in the bathroom plug hole, confirming the worst fears of everyone. Police did not believe that April's whole body was burned, but believed the fragments of bone got into the fire and bath during the cleanup. Searches of his house and laptop indicated that Bridger was a highly dangerous and predatory offender. This helped piece together why he had taken April and to satisfy his sinister desires. His internet search history showed that he had an extremely unhealthy interest in children. He had computer folders filled with images of child sexual abuse, graphic depictions of rape, and pictures of previous young murder victims including Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, 2 10-year-old girls who were murdered in Soham, and 13-year-old Caroline Dickinson, who was raped and murdered in a French hostel during a school trip. There were some pictures available on his computer which officers believed had been taken from Facebook and other social media of children in the local area, including April and her older sister. Following this discovery, Jasmine remembered that Mark Bridger had actually approached her on social media several months before April was abducted. She was in her living room on her laptop when she got a Facebook notification. A new friend requested come through. It was Mark Bridger. She didn't know him and showed it to her father. Paul knew him from the early 1990s when they had dated sisters, but he couldn't understand why he was adding his daughter. Coral also warned her not to accept the request. Jasmine deleted him, and that was seemingly the end of it. When the news started to spread that the case was now moving from a missing child case to a murder inquiry, around 150 people attended a church vigil for April led by the Bishop of Bangor, Andy John, and Reverend Rogers. The despair and disappointment was evident. Reverend Rogers said, "There was over 150 people there, including the police, and we're very, very grateful to them for all that they are doing. It was very silent in there, and it was a very powerful and very moving service." The town was covered in pink ribbons in response to April's mother's appeal for people to wear her daughter's favorite color. Police renewed their appeal for information over suspect Mark Bridger's movements. Following this, investigators revealed that they had received more than 2,500 calls in response to their latest appeal for information. Prime Minister David Cameron said it was every family's nightmare and urged anyone with information to come forward and speak to the police. The time that officers had to question Bridger was rapidly running out. Police had until 5 p.m. to charge or release him. Although they could apply for a further 24 hours warrant of detention, Bridger appeared in court in Aberystwyth at 3:30, where police were given another 24 hours to question him. Once again, the community came out in full force. Around 450 responded to a call for people with good local knowledge to search the villages around where April had lived. Volunteers were told to keep away from the river, the forest, and places such as mine shafts, which were being searched by the specialist teams. On Saturday, October 6th, 5 days after April had disappeared, Mark Bridger was charged with abduction, murder, and perverting the course of justice in relation to the attempt to conceal any trace of her body. The district Crown prosecutor from the Crown Prosecution Service said that following a review of everything that had been gathered, he believed they had sufficient evidence to charge Mark Bridger with the murder of April Jones and that it is in the public interest to do so. I have also concluded that there is sufficient evidence to charge the defendant with attempting to pervert the course of justice and child abduction. This announcement led to mixed emotions. On the one hand, there was relief that the perpetrator had been caught, but also heartbreak not only for the Jones family, but for April, whose life had been taken in the most appalling way imaginable. But who exactly was Mark Bridger? He was born on the November 6th in 1965 in Sutton, Surrey. He was the second of 3 children, and his father had worked as a City of London police constable. After attending secondary school, he went Croydon College, where he failed to complete a diploma in engineering. Bridger grew into a strong man, a very big build, and over 6 foot tall. Accounts from people he worked with described him as sociable, hardworking, and charismatic. Others remarked on his apparent obsession with the military and how he had claimed to be a former Army bomb disposal expert who had changed his identity to protect himself from any retaliation from the Irish Republican Army. He also said he had been a serving member of the SAS. When interviewed by police over April's disappearance, he told them how he had excelled during his military service. But this was nothing more than an utter fantasy. Mark Bridger had never joined the Army or served in the armed forces. Far from being a distinguished veteran, as a teenager, he had been in trouble with the police. For example, in the early 1990s, he was convicted of criminal damage, affray, and driving with no insurance. In 1984, he became a firefighter in London, but within 6 months, he had quit due to what he called personal problems. It was around this time he allegedly split with his partner soon after the birth of their son. The split meant his parents could not get access to their new grandchild, causing a rift from which the family would never recover. Bridger would tell people in later years that his parents were dead. It was at this point that Bridger turned his attention to Wales. He knew South Wales because his grandmother had lived there. He lived in several places where he had a variety of jobs, including bar work, being a chef, a waiter, a car recovery mechanic, and a forestry worker. After moving repeatedly, he finally settled in McClintock. Once there, he had worked a variety of jobs: kitchen assistant as a local hotel, a welder, helping renovate a local guest house, a lifeguard, and a slaughterman in an abattoir. He had 6 children with a number of women, and just days before April was abducted, he had split with his latest girlfriend and was deeply upset about it. He claimed he turned to drink after relationship breakups and had been on antidepressants on and off for 12 years. The attention of women was clearly important to him. Hours before he took April, he contacted 3 women via Facebook asking if they wanted to meet. No strings attached. They also found in his search history, more disturbingly, at 12:11 p.m., Mark Bridger had looked at a cartoon image from his collection of pictures showing young girls being sexually abused. One showed a girl bound with gaffer tape being raped by an adult. When his vehicle was recovered later, there was a roll of gaffer tape on his dashboard. The police now had a much more complete picture of what they believed had happened to April. When he abducted her, he wasn't aware that another child had witnessed it. At 8:30 p.m. that night, his Land Rover was spotted arriving at his home in a village 3 miles from where April had lived. Police did not know if this was the first time he'd been home since abducting April, or if he'd driven there directly after abducting her, killed her there, and then went out again to dispose of her body. This sighting may have not been the first time he returned home that day. The next day, shortly before 9 a.m., Bridget was spotted close to a river bank, carrying a black bin bag. A witness would later tell police she thought there was something in the bag. Later, he took his Land Rover into a garage to be repaired and pretended to help look for April before being arrested soon after. Fast-track DNA testing established that April's blood had been found at Mount Pleasant, most significantly on the underside of the carpet in the living room and in front of the wood burner. Police believe he probably sexually assaulted April before brutally murdering her and dismembering her body, disposing of her at various locations. As Mark Bridger had worked as a slaughterman in an abattoir, one theory was that he had used the skills he had gained there to dismember April's body after killing her. Bridger was due before the magistrates in Aberystwyth on the following Monday. The police said they remained focused and committed to finding April, adding that 10 specialist teams had been conducting a systematic and methodical search from daybreak on Saturday. Mark Bridger appeared to have a wrist with magistrates' court. A small crowd waited outside, and one man threw a bottle at the van that had transported him to court, while others shouted abuse. Bridget was later driven away to HMP Manchester, formerly known as Strangeways. 6 months after April went missing, her family marked what would have been her 6th birthday by releasing pink balloons from the Bernago Green where she used to play. On Monday, January 14, 2013, it was time for Mark Bridger to enter his plea. He pleaded not guilty to abduction, murder, and concealing, disposing of, or destroying April's body. But it emerged that his case was that he was probably responsible for her death. April's parents saw Bridger in person for the first time since he had abducted their daughter. Coral and Paul would go to every day of the trial, determined to see this awful ordeal through to its conclusion. In March 2013, it was reported by the BBC that the search for April's body was set to end in the coming weeks. Although they hadn't recovered her body, the police and Crown Prosecution Service worked together to push on and prepare their case for trial. The trial was initially arranged for 2 months after the point of charge, giving officers and prosecutors an incredibly tight timeline to try and pull together all their arguments and evidence. When his trial began on April 29th, Mark Bridger continued the same story he had tried to spit in his interviews. He was in denial about his actions and tried to present himself as a caring individual who had tried to help April after the tragic accident he was adamant had occurred. The testimony of April's friend who had witnessed the abduction was to be crucial in countering his story. She said that April had got into the front and then clambered into the back. It just drove off. I didn't know she was going to go in the van. The girl fiddled with her hair and sometimes hugged her bear as she was questioned by Bridges barrister, Brendan Kelly QC. Kelly, who like all court officials was not wearing a wig or gown, asked if she had a good view of the Land Rover. "Yes, I did," she replied. "Are you sure that you saw April talking to the man?" "Yes, I'm sure," she answered. It also emerged that Bridger had taken his Land Rover to a garage at 9 a.m. the day after April disappeared, saying he had been in an accident. A member of staff told the court that while everybody locally had been upset about April's disappearance, they found it odd that he was so upset by it all and that he looked on the verge of crying as he spoke about it. The mechanic said he kept asking how much his vehicle would cost to repair and when he could have it back. He said he appeared nervous and edgy. Another person who had joined the search for April traveled through the village where Bridget was living. She said she had seen him in a lay-by carrying what looked like a black bin liner in his hand. The lay-by was close to the river and less than half a mile from his house, and the evidence just continued to mount. When he spoke to a postman about April, he feigned shock and asked what sort of vehicle the police were looking for. But he managed to contradict himself later when he joined a search party at about 2 p.m. First telling one volunteer he had found out at 9:30 that morning, then telling another he had been searching throughout the night. April's head teacher provided an insight into the relationships he had formed when she gave evidence at his trial. She told the court how he had a history of relationships with young mothers and there were complex relationships between a number of these families. She had spoken to Bridger at a parents' evening just a couple of hours before he had taken April, when she had seen him talking to a former pupil now in secondary school, which she found strange. April's father also gave evidence as he had known Bridger since the early 1990s when the pair had dated sisters. He remembered Bridget as being a risk-taker who drove like a maniac. He spoke of how he had loaned Bridget a book on SAS survival skills, which he would not return, claiming to have lost it. Paul said he later found it during a visit to Bridger's house and took it back. As Bridger's behavior in the hours before April's abduction had become more predatory, the court heard how he had made an approach to a 10-year-old girl playing near to where April had last been seen. He invited her to a sleepover with his daughter, but no arrangements were finalized. During the police interviews, Bridger maintained that April had not been to his house, but when confronted in court by the overwhelming forensic evidence, he told the jury that images of her laying down in front of the fire had come to him in his dreams. After all the evidence had been presented, it was time for the jury to retire to consider their verdict. And on the May 30th, they had come to a conclusion. Mark Bridger was found unanimously guilty on all 3 counts. He was sentenced to life in prison with a whole life order. He looked down at the floor as his sentence was handed out and said nothing. Despite knowing he will never be a free man again, he has refused to disclose exactly what happened to April that night or where her body is, and no more remains of April Jones have ever been found. Many believe that this is the last piece of control he is not willing to relinquish. At the conclusion of his trial, Mark Bridger was described as a pathological and glib liar, a pedophile who harbored sexual and morbid fantasies about young girls. He chose to put witnesses through the ordeal of giving evidence over a lengthy trial that had lasted 4.5 weeks. He could have avoided all of it by pleading guilty in the first instance to the charges that had been leveled against him. Detective Superintendent Andrew John, who had led the investigation, said, "Mark Bridger is an evil and manipulative individual who clearly likes to be in control. He has committed the most horrific of crimes, the abduction and murder of a young, vulnerable girl. He appears to be somebody who is a fantasist." In July 2013, it was reported by the BBC that Mark Bridger had been attacked while in prison. The 47-year-old was attacked with a makeshift blade as he walked along the gangway at Wakefield Prison in West Yorkshire. He was treated in hospital where he required stitches. His injuries were not life-threatening, and he was returned to prison the same day. In September 2013, the family had a burial funeral with many turning up to pay their respects. As they didn't have a body, the family buried an empty casket pulled on a horse-drawn carriage, with the burial site being the graveyard just yards away from where she had disappeared. They were given ash and bone fragments from the police to bury, and the family also buried personal items alongside. This gave the family a spot they could visit to remember April and be together as a family. In December 2013, the judicial office said that Mark Bridger had lodged an application for permission to appeal. But the following month, they confirmed that he had abandoned his attempt just 11 days before the hearing was due to take place. In November 2018, Leading search engine companies announced they were going to make it harder to find child abuse images online. As many as 100,000 search terms would now return no results that find illegal material. Following the horrors that had occurred at Mount Pleasant, the property was later demolished. April's family were there to watch the demolition. Tragically, April's father, Paul, developed a rare brain disease. The family revealed in February 2018 that the diagnosis had left him unable to remember the murder. His wife, Coral, told the Mirror that Paul could not understand why April hadn't visited him in hospital. Her family are adamant that she will be remembered for the joy and happiness she brought to so many people, and not for the tragic way that she left this earth. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. On the afternoon of March 14th, 1968, 3 boys were playing in a muddy farm field near the intersection of Newland Street and Yorktown Avenue in Huntington Beach, California when they made a chilling discovery. They came across the body of a young woman who had suffered severe beatings, a slashed throat, and evidence of sexual assault was found during her autopsy. Police meticulously searched the field and identified tracks that suggested the woman's body might have been discarded from the passenger side of a vehicle. Police had few leads to follow to identify the woman's killer, but also had few direct clues to identify the woman. She had no identification with her, and a missing persons report consistent with her appearance did not come in during the following days. The woman was white or Hispanic, approximately 5 feet 1 inch tall, and between 20-30 years old. No drugs or alcohol were found in her system. She was wearing a floral shirt, purple pants, a black jacket, and a ring with a blue stone. Her black shoes were one of the best leads investigators had, as that brand of shoe was only sold in New York at the time. Authorities theorized that their Jane Doe may have been someone from the East Coast who hitchhiked to California. She had potentially then been killed by someone she accepted a ride from. Despite following up on several leads, police could still not identify their victim, which in turn limited their avenues of investigation into her murder as they could not investigate any of known acquaintances or identify any motives to want to harm her. Decades passed with the woman remaining unidentified and her killer remaining unpunished. One of the boys who had found her grew up, joined the Huntington Beach Police Department, and retired with the woman remaining unidentified that entire time. Eventually, the case became Orange County's oldest unsolved Jane Doe case. Authorities did not give up on identifying the woman and her killer, however, and as technology improved over the ensuing decades, they used it to generate new leads. Her fingerprints were entered into state and federal databases, and in 2011, her partial DNA profile was developed from blood on her blouse and entered into the combined DNA index system. In 2016, images of her body as well as pictures of her ring and shoes were released to the public in a renewed effort to locate someone who could identify her. In 2001, her clothes and rape kit had been processed, and a male DNA sample was identified. There was no match to it in any criminal database, however. The cigarette butt found near the body was examined in hopes of finding DNA in 2010. A male DNA profile, consistent with the one identified in 2001 from the rape kit and clothes, was developed from it, but authorities still could not identify the man whose DNA it was. In 2010, homicide detective Pat Ellis began working on the case with his partner, Mark Riley. He remained working on the case until his retirement in January 2020. Jane Doe's body had been exhumed in 2019, but testing was unable to provide a full DNA sample. She was buried in an unmarked grave in Newport Beach rather than in a potter's grave in hopes that technology would one day advance even more and it would be easier to exhume her again for further testing. One of the last things Detective Ellis did before retiring was order new testing of Jane Doe's clothes. This retesting did finally result in a complete DNA profile of Jane Doe. Now that they had a complete DNA profile, turned to genetic genealogy as a potential means of finally identifying Jane Doe. In July of 2020, 52 years after the murder, authorities announced that by using genetic genealogy, They had identified both their Jane Doe and her presumed killer. Jane Doe was Anita Louise Pato, who had been 26 at the time of her death. One of 7 children, she had moved to California from Maine in 1967 because of a fascination with the film industry. She remained in contact with her family through letters, which had abruptly stopped coming after February of 1968. Her family was concerned about the sudden lack of communication from May came and went without her returning home. They truly began to worry. Her parents and siblings did not have the means to travel to California, but they remained in contact with authorities in the state trying to find Anita. By 1980, Anita's niece, Lori Curian, had also become involved in the search. She maintained regular contact with police in Whittier, California, where Anita had been renting a room and had posted her final letter, and the Social Security Administration in hopes of finding her. Anita's parents, as well as 3 of her siblings, passed away before she was, but her surviving 2 sisters and brother were relieved to finally know what became of Anita. The man whose DNA was found at the scene was also identified as Johnny Crisco. Crisco could not be arrested for the crime because he had passed away in 2015. He died of throat cancer at the age of 71 in Washington state. Crisco's criminal history began when he was just 17. He had then joined the Army and become a paratrooper. He was discharged from the Army after 3 years when he failed a psychological examination. During the exam, he was diagnosed with positive aggressive reaction or having a pattern of being quick to anger, easy to feel unjustly treated, chronically resentful, immature, and impulsive, according to investigators. Crisco was arrested in 1971, but his record was subsequently purged. He married 3 times and had 2 children. Both of his children and one of his ex-wives have passed away. Following his death, his body went unclaimed. Authorities are still unsure of how and Anita came into contact or if they were in any way previously connected before the day of the murder. They are asking anyone who may be able to provide such information to call the Huntington Beach Police tip line. Anita's body was returned to her family in Maine. They held a private service for her, with some of the investigators from California in attendance. Anita was buried in Waterville, Maine. While they will never see Anita's killer brought to justice, the remaining members of her family are relieved to have finally found answers and been given the opportunity to lay Anita to rest. It is a big weight lifted off. She is not missing anymore, said Anita's niece, Lori. She is close to us now. We have a sense of peace that comes with that. Michelle Missy Jones was born on May 13, 1962. She attended Park West Continuation School, where she helped found a yearbook club. After graduation, she found a job working as a police dispatcher in Claremont, California. She loved to dance and go roller skating and was meticulous about keeping her hair and nails done. She was popular and regularly invited to parties. 18-year-old Missy was getting ready for a July 4th party, the last time her family saw her. She did not come home from the party, which was out of character for her. So her parents began calling all of her friends looking for her on the morning of July 5th, 1980. That same morning, police received a phone call reporting that a woman's body had been found in a grapefruit grove near the intersection of Live Oak and Santa Ana Avenues in Fontana, California. Her head was partially covered in dirt, and she was naked. It was later determined that she had been sexually assaulted. By that afternoon, the woman had been identified as Missy Jones, and her family was notified. Several pieces of evidence were collected at the scene, and police followed up on several leads. Unfortunately, the case went cold. Missy's sister Melissa walked past the cemetery where Missy was buried every day of her senior year of high school on her way to school. She would wonder about the things Missy would have been doing with her life had she not been killed and try to figure out who could have taken from their family and why they would want to do something so terrible to someone so loving and kind. Both of Missy's parents passed away never knowing who killed their daughter. In 2020, samples taken by police 4 decades earlier were processed for DNA. A profile from a single male individual was developed, but there was no match to it in the combined DNA index system. Authorities then began re-interviewing members of Missy's family. They identified a potential suspect, a former boyfriend of one of Missy's sisters. The man was now 66 years old and living in Las Vegas. Police surveilled the man and surreptitiously an item he discarded to test it for DNA. It was a match to the DNA found at the crime scene. On September 8, 2020, 40 years after Missy's murder, Leonard Nash was arrested for the crime in Nevada to be extradited back to California. On Saturday, September 19, 2020, Missy's family held a service at her graveside to honor her memory and celebrate the solving of her case. They released 40 balloons, one for each year they had been without her. In addition, the family also used the service to remember other families who are still waiting for the answers they have finally found. "We're also doing this for everyone else who's had to go through what we've been through," said Missy's sister Melissa. "There are so many people out there whose loved ones were killed or have gone missing, and they still have no idea what happened." Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. 17-year-old Mary London was a student at Sacramento High School. She was developmentally disabled and, therefore, still in the 10th grade. At the beginning of 1981, she was living in a foster home. She never came home on January 14, 1981. The following morning, January 15th, Mary's body was found along a rural stretch of San Juan Road in North Sacramento. She was wearing only white socks and one shoe. She had been sexually assaulted and then stabbed multiple times. Dozens of interviews were conducted and numerous leads followed, but Mary's killer remained unidentified. In 2016, Mary's case was reopened. Authorities made a public appeal to try to identify someone known only as Daryl, who was not considered a suspect in the case. He was instead a friend of Mary's, and police thought it was important for them to speak with him. DNA evidence was also available in the case, and while the technology needed to utilize it to solve the crime did not exist in 1981, it did in 2020. On April 22, 2020, Sacramento Police Chief Daniel Hahn and County District Attorney and Marie Schubert announced that genetic genealogy had used to identify Mary London's murderer, a man named Vernon Parker. Parker had not previously been a suspect in the case, and he had not even come up during the course of the initial investigation. Unfortunately, Parker, who had been approximately the same age as Mary, could not be prosecuted for the crime because he was deceased. He had been murdered in downtown Sacramento just over a year after Mary's murder. "You can't escape justice," Chief Hahn pointed out. "You can't outrun the horrific things you have done to another human being in our community." One of the original detectives on the case was David Schwartz, a father of 8 originally from Wisconsin. He never forgot about Mary's case, which was finally solved around the time he turned 90. He was personally satisfied that the case was closed and very happy for Mary's family to finally have answers. He made sure he was there to meet Mary's half-sister, Esther Schneider, and her daughter when the announcement of the identification of Mary's killer was made. He would have liked to have given her a hug on the occasion but had to maintain a safe social distance. In 1981, Esther had only learned of her sister's death after seeing it on the news. In 2020, she was informed that the case was solved in person. She was grateful to everyone who worked on Mary's case over the years and believes her sister can now finally be at peace. 62-year-old Miyuki Harwood worked as a computer systems analyst for Intel. In 2015, she moved from Orangevale, California to Folsom, California. In her spare time, she loved to be outdoors. She was a knowledgeable and experienced backpacker and hiker. Miyuki was very independent and normally went on hikes and backpacking trips alone. In June of 2015, she went on a solo hike of the Grand Canyon. That August, however, she decided to go on an 8-day group backpacking trip with the Sierra Club that would go through the Sierra National Forest and Kings Canyon National Park. Miyuki did not know anyone else going on the trip. On August 20th, 6th day of the trip, the group went on a hike up Black Cat Mountain in the Sierra National Forest. Miyuki's fellow hikers last saw her around 1 p.m., but she then became separated from them. Be a part of the effort to find Miyuki. 60 search and rescue workers combed the area for her, and search dogs, helicopters, and a drone were all utilized. The search effort was complicated by a nearby fire, referred to as the Rough Fire, which had started at the end of July and was burning just 10 miles from the search area. The fire impacted air quality and complicated helicopter flight. Miyuki's traveled to the area during the search, and her brother flew in from Japan. Miyuki's disappearance was made even more painful for them by its timing. She went missing near the 10-year anniversary of her husband Brett's unexpected death. On August 29th, 9 days after Miyuki disappeared, a group was searching near the Courtright Reservoir when they heard the sound of a whistle in the distance. They followed the sound and finally found Miyuki signaling for help with a whistle at the bottom of a rocky ravine. She was injured and unable to walk, so she had to be airlifted out of the area. The fire made it difficult for a helicopter to land in the area, but it was eventually able to successfully reach her. Miyuki was then airlifted to Community Regional Medical Center in Fresno, where she underwent the first of 2 surgeries she would require on her legs. After she was rescued and brought to the hospital, Miyuki released a letter explaining the circumstances that left her alone in a remote area for over a week with limited supplies. Miyuki reached the summit of the mountain with the rest of her group but wanted to get back to their campsite, so she decided to head back down the mountain alone, a decision which she regretted. She got lost and eventually fell off of a small cliff after it got dark. She hit the ground below feet first, shattering her left leg, breaking her right ankle, and sustaining a compression fracture in her spine in the process. She remained conscious and thought that if she rested where she fell overnight, she would be strong enough to make it back to the campsite the following day. In the morning, however, she realized that she was still completely unable to walk. While Miyuki was on an 8-day excursion, the trek up Black Cat Mountain was essentially a day trip for the group, and Miyuki's main, large backpack was back at the campsite, and she only had what could fit in her smaller backpack with her. She had little food beyond small items like nuts and a 1-liter water bottle. The bottle was almost empty by the day after her fall, and she knew she could not survive long without finding a source of water. Luckily, she could hear the sound of water flowing nearby. She spent the next 2 days dragging herself across the ground to reach a creek. She had a water filter with her and was able to use it to refill her water bottle every day. Temperatures dropped substantially at night, and Miyuki was only wearing a medium-weight jacket. She was able to pull herself into the sunlight during the day to warm up. Miyuki knew that people were out looking for her during her ordeal. She saw and heard the search helicopters starting the day after she was separated from her group, but had no way to signal them, and they were unable to see her. She had previously heard another group of searchers calling for her and had used her whistle to try to get their attention, but they had not heard her. Miyuki's injuries were serious but not life-threatening. She had to spend some time in a physical rehabilitation center as a part of her lengthy recovery. In January of 2016, the Fresno County Sheriff's Search and Rescue Team received a commendation for their work during Miyuki's rescue. Miyuki, still requiring crutches, was in attendance at the ceremony. She was reunited with some of her rescuers, most of whom she had not seen since she was rescued. She thanked them for not giving up on her and for saving her life. 22-year-old Rachel Lloyd graduated from North Carolina State University in December of 2015. Before beginning her graduate studies in interpersonal communication at the University of Texas, she moved to New Zealand to study at Massey University in Palmerston North for a semester. In April of 2016, her mother, Carolyn of Charlotte, North Carolina, flew to New Zealand to visit her. On April 26th, Rachel and Carolyn embarked on a hike along the Kapakapanui Track and Tururu Forest Park, a conservation park in the Wellington region. The track takes, on average, 6 to 8 hours to hike, and one of the best viewpoints in the park is at the summit of Kapakapanui. Both mother and daughter were experienced day hikers. Rachel and Carolyn followed orange trail markers up to the summit and then spent some time enjoying the sun before heading back down. However, at some point during their descent, they started seeing blue trail markers instead of the orange ones. They decided that there must be an alternative way back down. They would later learn that they were not. The blue markers were there to track possums. 20 minutes into their hike down, Rachel and Carolyn stopped seeing the blue markers. However, the terrain they had covered was far too steep for it to possible for them to go back the way they came. Therefore, they continued on, trying to get back to the main track. Rachel and Carolyn instead eventually ended up on a small ledge that overlooked a 600-foot waterfall. It was beginning to get dark, and the overnight temperature dropped down to around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Rachel and Carolyn clung onto each other to try to stay warm and held onto a tree, trying to stay awake out of fear that they would roll down the steep terrain if they fell asleep. When the sun was up enough for them to navigate through the dense vegetation that surrounded them, they climbed down the ledge. At the base of the waterfall, they found a creek and decided to follow it. Unfortunately, Rachel slipped on a rock along the creek. She fell into the cold water and hit her head on a rock underneath the water. In addition to the head injury, Rachel also had to deal with hypothermia, which quickly began to set in. She could never get dry and therefore could never get warm after the fall. Rachel and Carolyn only had a limited of cheese and nuts they had packed for what they had thought would be just a day trip and tried to ration their limited food supply. But the lack of proper calories made the injured Rachel even more weak. Rachel eventually could no longer see or hear and started losing feeling in one of her legs. Caroline then carried their backpack on her front and carried her daughter on her back for as long as she could. By the third day of their ordeal, Rachel could no longer keep going. Carolyn made a makeshift campsite and a bed made out of fern fronds for her daughter. Rachel's condition deteriorated to the point where she believed herself to be close to death, and she relayed her dying wishes to her mother. As the word help in giant letters, once in a clearing and once in an open area by the creek, in hopes that a passing aircraft would eventually see it. There were aircraft in the area, and they were there looking for Carolyn and Rachel. Carolyn's husband and Rachel's father, Barry Lloyd, was at home in North Carolina but had been in contact with his wife throughout her trip so far. He became concerned when a day passed without him hearing from her or their daughter. Local authorities also became involved when Rachel and Carolyn failed to return their rental car or check into a hotel as planned. The rental car was found at the conservation park 2 days after the mother and daughter began their hike and a search began for them. All-terrain vehicles, search dogs, and helicopters were all brought in as part of the effort. Official search and rescue workers, as well as numerous volunteers, helped look for Rachel and Carolyn. Barry Lloyd remained in contact with the emergency personnel in New Zealand, and his sons had flown to Charlotte from Chicago and were getting ready to fly to New Zealand with him to help with the search. A helicopter from Amalgamated Helicopters flew search teams into the park on April 30th, leaving them at different vantage points to look for the missing mother and daughter. The pilots then flew over the area to look for Carolyn and Rachel themselves. In the process, they saw Carolyn's messages and relayed the location to the search teams. On the 5th day of their ordeal, Rachel and Caroline were airlifted out of the park and taken to Wellington Hospital. While Carolyn was weak, she did not need to be admitted to the hospital. Rachel's injuries and hypothermia did require a hospital stay. She would later say that she believed she would have only survived for a few more hours had she not been rescued and given medical attention. After she was released from the hospital, Rachel remained in New Zealand to complete her semester of studies. Carolyn's brother, John Schumacher, released a statement on behalf of the family after the rescue. "My entire family wishes to express our tear-filled gratitude to all the amazing police staff, helicopter pilots, search team members, dog guides. Testament, the wonderful citizens of New Zealand are to the rest of the world, of how people can work together to accomplish such noble deeds. Thank God and thank you all." 77-year-old Carol Kaparsky and her 72-year-old husband, Ian Irwin, lived in Palo Alto, California. They were both respected academics. Carol was a linguist and author, and Ian was a noted Parkinson's researcher. They lived in a very tight-knit neighborhood and were very active in their community. A neighbor described them as aging hippies who had a holistic approach to most aspects of their life and were passionate about various progressive causes. In February of 2020, the couple rented a vacation cottage near Inverness in Marin County, California through Airbnb. They had stayed in this cottage before and were familiar with the area and its nearby trails. They were to check out of the cabin on Saturday, February 15th. However, when a housekeeper arrived to clean the cottage that day, Carol and Ian were not there, but all of their belongings, including their car, wallets, and phones were. They missed an appointment the following day and then later failed to keep plans with their family, which was highly unusual. The last sighting of the couple before their disappearance was around 4 p.m. on February 14th as they were walking along a road in Inverness. Based on where they were seen, They could have been heading to area trails in the Tamales Bay State Park or to the trails that would take them down to Tamales Bay itself. As such, both land and water searches were undertaken, lasting 10 to 12 hours per day. Helicopters, drones, and search dogs were all used. Hundreds of people looked for the missing couple in the following days. Authorities had reason to believe that Carol and Ian could still be alive even after a few days and a cold snap that had dropped the temperature to just below freezing on several of the nights they were missing. They were both experienced hikers with specialized skills. Ian had a background in mountaineering, and Carol was an herbalist and mushroom hunter. Their optimism finally started to wane by February. Marin County Sheriff's Office announced that they were considering the search a recovery effort rather than a rescue. Carol and Ian each had a son from a previous relationship, and each of them also began accepting the possibility that they might need to hold a memorial service and hoping that they could at least find bodies to bury so that they could have some sense of closure. 2 days after that announcement was made, on Saturday, February 22nd, more than a week after the couple went missing, 60 people were still out searching for them. Around 10 a.m., a 3-year-old golden retriever named Groot with the California Rescue Dog Association led volunteers into an area of thick vegetation in the creek drainage leading to Shallow Beach. There, they found Carol and Ian. Ian was lying on top of thorny bushes and poison oak to protect Carol, who was without shoes, from being exposed to them. Both Carol and Ian were grateful and relieved when they saw the volunteers who gave them their own gear to warm them up and enough food and water to keep them strong through their transport out of the area. They were airlifted to a local hospital where they were reunited with their sons. Despite the fact that they had both only been wearing mid-weight jackets, they only suffered from mild hypothermia. They both had numerous cuts and scratches from the dense vegetation in the woods. Carol and Ian had gone to watch the sunset on Valentine's Day and had taken none of their hiking equipment with them because they planned to only be gone for half an hour. However, they got lost on a trail in the woods in the dark and eventually fell. They tried to continue on but became trapped in the thick bramble. Carol eventually lost her shoes in deep mud, and Ian lost his eyeglasses and hearing aids. They had spent the last 4 days of their ordeal in the spot where they were eventually found, surviving off of muddy water from a nearby puddle and the edible parts of a nearby fern. They were not far from a road but were unable to reach it because the vegetation had grown too thick to fight through. Carol and Ian were both in good spirits as they were rescued and during their hospital stays. Their family issued a statement expressing their gratitude for all of the people who had participated in the search. Their neighbors decorated their house to welcome them home after they recovered from their 8-day ordeal. This isn't my personal experience, but rather a story I heard from a fellow member of my caving club. It's a bit unsettling, but I believe it holds significance, so please bear with me. In Iwate Prefecture, there are countless caves. During the time this tale unfolds, these caves weren't as popular among tourists as they are now. So many remained unmapped and partially unexplored due to infrequent internal surveys. At that time, large-scale survey events were organized within the caving community, and this particular story revolves around one such extensive cave survey conducted on a winter's day. Participants broke up into groups with the more experienced members of the club trying to map and investigate the cave. There were areas which had already been mapped, and some of the caving club members grew a bit bored of measuring areas of the cave. They were just wandering around at their own pace. They were more interested in taking photos and looking for wildlife. This wasn't a good idea. This is why I guess we are told this cautionary tale when we joined the club. One of the cave explorers decided to crawl down a narrow opening in the cave. The others in the club knew, based on the survey, that there was nothing but a dead end, so initially they weren't concerned. Unfortunately, that changed quickly. We knew he would go in, find nothing, and probably squirm his way back out backwards since it was incredibly narrow. But after a few minutes passed, he didn't come back. We all gathered around and began to panic. We looked at the tiny crevasse he had managed to crawl through, and then someone in the club asked aloud, "Is there enough room to turn around in there?" Another chimed in with what we were all thinking. Did he get stuck? There was a sober silence which was broken by the sound of someone shuffling. He came back out the crevasse. I can't tell you how relieved I was to see him. Something was wrong though. He looked jaded and frightened. Not only that, he didn't come out backwards. He came out facing everyone. It seemed impossible. He began to mumble about what had just happened in that narrow crevasse. I got to the dead end, but there was something more. There was an even narrower hole. For some reason, I poked at it and discovered that the earth beneath the hole could be moved aside. After working at this for a while, I managed to get the hole wide enough to fit both my arms through, then my whole body. It opened up into a reasonably wide chamber. That's how he was able to turn around. He went on. I thought I had found an undiscovered part of the cave and I was really excited. I shot my torch all over the cave and my torchlight fell on something. A doll or maybe a mannequin was lying on the cave floor. I had heard of seeing things in caves, stalagmites which appeared to look like humans, as well as odd formations of mud on the cave floor. I was aware my eyes could play tricks on me in the dark, but none of this accounted for the fact that this human-shaped mass was wearing glasses. So you think it was human? He nodded his head silently. The caving club left and called the police. Later, the body was identified. According to the police, it was the body of a high school student who went missing a few years ago. He entered the cave with candles and some sweets, so he can establish he had intent to explore the cave. But for what purpose? Some speculate it was because he wanted to commit suicide. Others say he must have wanted to explore. Perhaps it was his own little secret base. Due to this portion of the cave being almost completely shut off, his body had been preserved from the elements. The only issue was that muddy water from above had dripped down onto the body. One strange thing was the glasses didn't have a drop of muddy water on them. If you've never been in a cave with no source of light, perhaps I can help you imagine what it's like. I've been in caves where I have turned the torch off just for a second. It was so dark, I couldn't tell whether my eyes were open or shut. I tried to stay in the dark as long as possible. The longest I could manage was about a minute. But I think that the everyday ordinary person could keep their sense of balance for about 10 minutes. But after that, you wouldn't know up from down. Then the mind wanders. The things in the dark, they can tolerate it, but man can't. The sounds, the loss of direction, it all adds up. It all takes a toll. The poor high school boy could have lasted 30 minutes or so without panicking there. I'm assuming there was some sort of cave-in which buried the only exit. Things would have gotten worse when his matches got wet, or perhaps he couldn't find where he put the candles. At this point, he would have regretted his decision to enter the cave, as there would be no one to hear his whimpers or screams for help. He would be cursing himself time and time again for coming or for not bringing a torch. Maybe even wishing he'd told someone where he was going. How many times did he trace his hands along the walls looking for the exit? Back and forth, back and forth. How many days did he live? What kind of hallucinations did he see? Unsure if he was awake or asleep, hallucinating or thinking straight, hunger or thirst. One of those would have come for him in the end, but not before his mind tormented him further. Maybe he didn't even truly feel like himself towards the end. Maybe his identity faded into the darkness. How many times did he scream, scratch the walls, cry? He would have died without even realizing he was alive or dead. Staring, backed into the corner, hiding from whatever was tormenting him. His glasses resting on his nose, pointing towards the exit he could no longer find. I think this is the most terrifying and tragic death I've ever heard. This happened while I was living at my mom's house a couple of years ago, and just thinking about this still makes my heart race. I shared a room with my mom during this time, so she slept on a queen bed and I was on the twin. In between our beds was a table with a lamp. Quick backstory. Whenever I would lay in bed back then, I would stretch my arms up towards the ceiling. I did this for many years before this happened and still do, just not when it's dark or when I'm alone. That night, I had fallen asleep in an awkward position while reading a book. I woke up in the middle of the night and my neck was aching from not having a pillow. I readjusted myself, and then I realized I had to use the bathroom. I went and then laid down. I remember feeling wide awake, thinking I wasn't going to be able to fall asleep. I grabbed my phone and looked at the time. It was 4 a.m. I remember the time because of what happened next. The room was dark and I was just laying there, staring up at the ceiling. I stretched my arms up not even a minute after setting my phone down and had the palms of my hands facing the ceiling. Almost immediately, I felt two hands slide onto mine. I was shocked. In my head, I was trying to figure out what was going on. For some reason, I imagined it was my mom's hands, that she had crawled onto my bed and placed her hands on mine. That thought scared me more, but I knew it wasn't her. I started gasping and sobbing, and my mom woke up and turned on the lamp. She was freaking out too now. I told her what happened and she seemed scared, but just told me to breathe and pray and sleep in the bed with her. I looked at the time and it was 4:05 a.m. I swear I was awake, but at the same time, I hope it was just a dream. This happened to my boyfriend when he was in his early teens. Him and a group of buddies went over to a friend's house, and one of them bought a Ouija board. They took the board to the basement to mess around with it. The friend's family bred chickens, and they kept them in a cage, also in the basement. As the boys were playing with the Ouija board, they were all laughing and quite skeptical if it actually worked. With their fingers on the indicator, they jokingly asked the board to do something to prove they were actually talking to a spirit. Suddenly, the light in the basement turned off, and then they could hear the chickens going wild, shrieking and rattling the cage around. The boys all screamed and ran upstairs. When they finally got the courage to go back downstairs, the chickens were all quiet. Upon further inspection, every single chicken had its neck snapped. When I was in school, I got into an argument with a very religious classmate. I am not into religion at all, and so I was asking him about this religion and how he can take this stuff so seriously because it sounds like fairy tales. He was obviously hurt by that and looked me in my eyes and said, "Your heart is not kind enough to let religion in." I felt like he had cursed me. He gave me goosebumps, but I just didn't pay any attention to it. In the night, I dreamed about a holy book which was in flames. I told my mother about my dream, and she immediately asked me if I think I need to apologize to someone. We are Persian, and it's very common in our culture to take dreams seriously. I said no, although I knew it was a lie. 2 days later, I was laying in my bed and was about to sleep when a very strange feeling got me. I felt like I really needed to leave my room and sleep in my parents' bed, which was strange enough as a teenager. The feeling was so strong I couldn't resist. So I went to my mother and asked her if it was okay if I sleep next to her. I fell asleep in their bed. In the middle of the night, I woke up and heard how my parents were walking through our house. It smelled like something was burning. I got out of bed quickly and ran to them as they were looking all around, instinctively in the kitchen first, then bathroom. We ended up in front of the door of my room. My mother opened the door, and in that moment a huge flame lit up. My bed was on fire. Everything happened so quickly. My mother told me to call 110, and I can remember that my father grabbed the end of my mattress and pulled it out of my room, outside in our yard, and there it burned until the firemen came. But it was too late already. I lost everything that night. All my clothes, my school books, even my floor was gone because it was wooden. I don't know if it was a curse or just a very strange coincidence, but it has taught me a big lesson. I never ever hurt someone's feelings on purpose. In March of 2016, in the regional town of Ballarat, Victoria, Australia, I started experiencing some strange activity in a house I had recently started renting. It began 3 days after my partner and I broke up and he moved out. The first night it started, I was fast asleep, alone, and woke to multiple alarm sounds coming from the kitchen. I awoke puzzled, having never heard them before, and headed downstairs to investigate. Both the fridge and the Wi-Fi modem were flashing irrefutably. After trying to reset them with no luck, I turned them both off at the power point, but the alarms continued. By sunrise, they had stopped, and I thought nothing more of it. An electrical fault, I thought. The next night, still alone, I woke up to what sounded like someone humming, coming from the kitchen. Upon sitting up in my bed, I noticed my cat was at the end with a full tail, eyes wide and locked towards the kitchen. With my heart in my throat, I went to investigate, but could not work out where it was coming from. On my way back to my room, the flashlight from my iPhone shone across the front door, and on the glass I could see the letter R had been written in the condensation. From inside of the house, I froze, not knowing if there was someone in the house. I grabbed my keys, purse and the cats and bolted to my car and drove to my mom's at 3 o'clock in the morning. I contemplated calling the police, but what would I tell them even if I couldn't be sure what it was? The next morning I returned home and fearfully went through each room. Everything looked normal except for the guest bathroom. The bathtub was full to the brim, but it didn't look like water. It was a pale blue. I took a photo before I emptied it and told myself, surely I am imagining this. I asked a friend to come and stay with me for the night. She agreed. We stayed up watching movies in my room until we were sleepy. At around 3 a.m., I woke to a creaking sound. I nudged my friend, whispering to her that I had heard something. The room began to feel really cold and the humming sound returned. I grabbed my phone and put the flashlight and video record on and pointed it towards the bedroom door. We sat silently for what seemed like forever. Watch the video back, my friend whispered. Upon doing so, we both screamed. There on the video, as clear as day, was a shadowy figure walking past the foot of my bed. We froze. Neither of us spoke for a while. We waited for the sun to come back up. You're staying at my house for a couple of days, my friend told me, but I'd already agreed to babysit my niece the following day. Not wanting to freak my sister out, she dropped my niece off at lunchtime and told me she'd return before dark. This is a perfect distraction, I thought, as my 6-year-old niece told me we'd spend the day coloring. Let's just color in my room today, I told her. A couple of hours later, she asked to go get a snack from her backpack in the kitchen. 10 seconds later, she hurriedly came back into my room. Auntie Kate, there was a man running at me in the lounge room. My heart sunk. There's no one here, Tay, but I'll go and have a look. I checked the house and decided to tell her it must have been her own reflection in the window. She looked puzzled. I reassured her and we returned to coloring. After a toilet break, I came back to my room and Taylor swiftly asked me, "What's that knocking noise, Auntie Kate?" I checked the front door thinking maybe my sister had come back early. There's no one there, Tay. Not the front door, Auntie Kate. Behind your bed. What do you mean, Tay? When you went to the toilet, that man was knocking from behind your bed. My heart was racing. Not wanting to show her how scared I was, I put a movie on and went and called my sister. "You need to come back," I said and explained what had been going on. When she arrived, she looked at me fearfully. "Kate, I don't think you should stay here." "I know, but I've got an early day tomorrow." Running low on options, I called my ex to come and stay the night. I didn't want to go into the full details of why, just that I was feeling a little bit uneasy by myself. We laid in bed and he said, "Something doesn't feel right." "What do you mean?" I said. "The energy. I just feel on edge." I turned and told him everything that happened and showed him the photo and the video. Neither of us slept that night, and he never let go of my hand. The next morning, he mentioned the shower head in the main bathroom was leaking. "I'll get a plumber," I said. "Thanks for staying." I agreed to meet the plumber on my lunch break. "Easy fix," he said and started making conversation. "So how long have you been here?" he asked. "Oh, not long," I replied, "but I don't think I'll be staying here much longer." "Why is that?" he asked. "Because there's something evil in this house. I've had the strangest and scariest week of my life." He turned round and looked at me and stared until I looked away. His expression was cold. "Are you nearly done?" I asked. "I really need to get back to work." "Not yet," he said, "but I need to tell you something." My skin began to crawl as I gripped my keys and took a step back. "My mom and dad died here," he said. "Dad died in your bathroom and mom died in the lounge." He took a step towards me as I took another step back. "And this week was the anniversary of their deaths," he said. "What happened?" I asked nervously as I reached behind me for the front door knob. "Nobody knows," he said. "What were their names?" I asked. "Robert and Alma." "Oh my God," I thought, flashing back to the R I had seen sprawled on the front door glass. "Sorry to hear," I choked. "So tell me, what's been happening here?" he asked, his expression still cold. "I think you need to leave. I've really got to get back to work." He didn't respond. "Please," I said. "I'm running late." As he packed up his tools, I waited cautiously outside. He brushed past me and said, "I'll leave the invoice in your letterbox, but you might want to get the lock on your front door changed." The plumber, their son, left, and 2 weeks later so did I. On moving day, whilst carrying boxes out of my car into the new house, I saw something sticking up out of the back seat. I picked it up, an old brown birthday card with a faded "Dear Daddy" written inside of it. unfinished in a child's handwriting. And that was the end of that chapter. To this day, I won't even drive down that street, and I hope I never have to call a plumber ever again. I had a little lamp when I was living alone in my apartment 7 years ago, which worked with batteries. I had this light on for a year without turning it off, so it was on 247 for nearly a year straight. It was in my bedroom and had given a nice and cozy ambience to my room. One day, I noticed that the light had turned off because of empty batteries. I just left it where it was and didn't change the batteries. On the anniversary of the death of my dear friend and beloved uncle, I was talking to my dad on the phone about him, and we were just talking a lot about how much we both missed him. I was really sad and thought about him intensely. Later that night, I went to bed and fell asleep. At about 4 in the morning, I suddenly woke up and saw that the little lamp was on. It was shining so bright that I was shocked and couldn't process what was happening for a while. It was strange because I fell asleep immediately after I saw the lights, which is not actually what I would normally do in that situation. The next day, I checked the lamp and it was off again. The batteries were still empty. But then in the next week's months, I'd noticed that the little lamp would always turn on when I felt sad or anxious or worried, all by itself. I never changed the battery until this day, 7 years later. It is still very special to me, and it has a very special place in our house. I'm married now and have been for 2 years, and this little lamp was shining when my husband was dating me and visiting me for the first time in my apartment back then. I knew it was a good sign right away. I like to think that my uncle has found a way to communicate with me through this little light. Back in the late 1980s, my grandma often helped babysit my older sister, while our mom was working nights at the hospital. During this time, my mom had moved into a duplex and the landlord was always on the grounds, not really doing anything. He was very determined to speak with my mom, but she never had time for him as she slept all day in preparation for her night job. Anyway, one night while my grandma was babysitting, she was lying down but awake on the living room couch, when suddenly, the front doorknob started jiggling. She held her breath, hoping whoever it was would find it locked and move on. However, a key rattled and the door creaked open. From where she lay, she could just make out it was the landlord. Too terrified to move, she squeezed her eyes shut and pretended to be asleep. As the landlord creaked closer, my sister started fussing in her playpen, nearly causing my grandma to scream. She was so scared he would go get my sister, but thankfully he walked into the dining room instead. He began rifling through the drawers of papers, and it dawned on my grandma that it couldn't have been the first time he'd entered my mom's apartment. It felt like hours for her before the landlord finally left, and she immediately put a chair against the door to prevent his return. After my mom got back in the morning, my grandma told her what happened. From then on, the door was blocked and valuables stashed elsewhere. It took a few months before my mom was able to move, and it was definitely a tense time for my grandma whenever she had to stay the night. Sometime between 2010 and 2012, I went on a camping trip with a few high school friends of mine in central Alberta. One of the friends I went with helped set up this trip by allowing us to use his private land with no houses nearby for miles or kilometers. The trip lasted for several days as planned before we eventually returned back to Edmonton. We didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, and everything appeared to be going all right. I drove my personal car with me and parked it close to our tents. I bought my own. I've never slept in a tent before, and for some odd reason, when my friends heard I wasn't willing to sleep in my tent for the night, the rest of my friends decided to sleep in my car as well. Bear in mind, it was a friendly trip and no romance stuff involved. This trip turned out to be a creepy experience, as I will explain why. One night, my friend TJ, who was with me during the trip, decided to take random pictures of our surroundings with no particular reason in mind. We were trying to have a good time. He did not check the pictures he took until he arrived back in the city when our trip was over. When I arrived at TJ's house back in Edmonton, we went over the pictures we had. One of the pictures he took revealed something we didn't notice at the time. We were both very surprised and creeped out, as you can imagine. As described in the photo description, he heard a noise that very night the picture was taken, and we were oblivious to his presence. We didn't do anything when finding out we were being watched the whole time. Only thing we did was post this picture online, and that's it. This revelation also made me think, what would have happened if we did sleep in our tents and knocked inside the car with the doors locked during the whole trip? I really don't know. Many things could have happened, and I'm glad that this person did not cause any harm whatsoever to either of us. It has been years since this happened, and I've moved on. But this is something I will possibly never forget. Life can be unpredictable. Make the most out of it, since we can't predict our future. So my dad had lymphoma and I was his nurse until the end. I'm an RN. He passed on the bed in my mom's guest room, the one I usually sleep on. So I go for Christmas. I live in the Sierra Nevadas in California, and it's way cold. So I'm asleep in the same bed, same room. At 4 a.m., my Akita wakes me, doing the I see something invisible thing. She's twirling and wagging her tail at something over my bed. Of course, I'm like, okay. Hi, Dad. Then went back to sleep. At 5 a.m., I distinctly hear my mom's sliding glass door open and shut for the dog. I thought, cool. Mom let MacGyver out. So I curl back up. It's cold. At 6:30, I wake up. No dog. So I walk out to see MacGyver freezing ass on the back porch by the sliding door. She had ice and snow on her whiskers, so I was pissed at my dear mom. And I'm like, Mom, why didn't you let her in? She swears up and down she didn't let my dog out. I really pestered her too. Until she died, we never said anything because we knew no one would believe us. It might be boring to you, but my dad let her out. I know it. I've been in my current apartment since 2011. I was definitely much younger at that time, and I didn't know anything about the place. The atmosphere and environment was quite friendly and warm, though people kept out of each other's business. I was close to my teenage years at that time, so there's no need to say I wanted company, i.e. friends, but people seemed so absorbed in themselves and so detached. I never found a friend from my locality. Very soon, I started keeping things to myself, and ignoring and not seeing people became a habit. I never noticed anything odd or worth noticing in my flat. Everything was quite natural. But my apartment, no doubt, looked very spooky from the outside since there was barely any people staying there except us. The apartment block is of 5 stories, including the terrace and the garage. My family is the only one that has stayed in the block for so long. My flat is in the southeast side of the block and is pretty much flooded with light, but the northwest side of the block is said to contain something negative. Nobody could ever live there for more than a few months. The first and second floor flats don't feel as though there is anything paranormal there. But the people staying there encounter unfortunate things, and a person even died there. This may sound like a sick superstition, but to be honest, it doesn't feel so. Weird things happen all over the northwest side of the block. But to the bad luck is the added fear, and this reaches an extreme level on the 3rd floor. We have never known of anybody staying in that room or flat for more than a month or 2. Recently, on asking why, we found out the answer. There is something paranormal going on there all the time. People leave that room because something or someone doesn't let them stay there. People always feel something roaming around. A year ago, a young man who lived there by himself told us he couldn't sleep for months because he felt someone standing beside his bed's headboard. He visibly saw something sitting on his bed, the bathroom door opening and the light switching on and then off after some time. He must be awarded respect for his courage, if nothing else. Staying there for a long time all by himself without company. Not just the bad look, but also feeling somebody's invisible presence was the final warning. He soon confided his fears to his friend, and with his friend's help, he managed to get rid of the bodiless soul who was said to have been the victim of something terrible. He bought some sort of doll with good spells overflowing from it. Since then, everything seems to have settled. But for some reason or another, after living out there for a year and a half, he moved out somewhere else and a new family is now there. They were told about the paranormal activities there and have taken all the precautions they can to prevent the terror. Fortunately, there have been no new complaints. But thinking of something so terrible happening just above my floor covers me with goosebumps. I had an eccentric old neighbor whose home she shared with her husband, Blue, even more ancient mother, and a menagerie of half-fed cats eager to supplement the scraps Hilda threw to them. Consequently, there were no birds to be found on either her property or ours. I was sharing a house with 2 flatmates. It was a comfortable, newly renovated 3-bedroom villa, but near the bottom of one of the steepest hills in the city in which I lived. We had already had a spectacular accident where a car, undergoing repairs in a person's garage further up the hill, had, unoccupied, backed itself out onto the road, and the forces of gravity had seen it go careering down the hill, coming through a resounding smash into Blue's old car. I heard the smash and investigated. One of my flatmate's boyfriends was an art student, and probably due to the fact he hadn't sold a particular piece, he allowed an impressively large timber-framed and glass-printed painting to be hung on the wall above our fireplace and the mantelpiece that were in the living room. The painting, probably 1.2 meters long and 600 millimeters deep, was interesting in that it was impressionist and spare. It featured a block of cats with claws graphically extended, leaping diagonally across towards the upper right corner. And what could just be seen? Birds escaping from that corner. It was a bizarre and quite violent thing to behold. It was a heavy piece, and I put up the painting, which had to have strong metal fastenings in the frame and to the wall itself. There was a link chain attached, and I thought job done. On the mantelpiece, meanwhile, I placed a pair of small ceramic quail birds that my mother had gifted me, which followed a similar artful design to that of the painting. One day, while I was home on my own and in the adjoining dining room, I heard an almighty crashing sound. I looked around. Surely there couldn't possibly be another runaway car. I went outside both front and back and could see nothing. As I was returning through the living room, I realized that the painting had broken from its fastening, and that was the cause of the loud sound that I'd heard. But it stayed on the wall, albeit one corner, was now precariously balanced on the mantelpiece. I quickly salvaged the painting, and I also discovered that one of the ceramic birds had been destroyed by the fall. I repaired the fastening, put the painting back up, and tidied up the mess, thinking that was a lucky escape. Sometime later, perhaps a few weeks, I was again on my own at home, and while speaking on the phone, I was distractedly looking back through the doorway into the living room. At that moment, there was again that very loud crash, and for what felt like slow motion. The painting came down onto the mantelpiece, then flipped over onto the floor, shattering the glass in the process. At this point, I returned and cleared all the glass from the frame, again repaired and rehung the now much lighter painting back in place. That evening, my flatmate returned, and we stood back from the painting as I explained what had happened. Mark, more observant than me, saw that the remaining bird, although still appearing to be in one piece, was incredibly shattered. I was stunned, and before I could absorb this latest occurrence, he casually pointed to the painting. And there, in the bottom corner of the painting, were the words written by the artist, "No birds." On January 26, 1996, in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, Dave Schultz was tuning the radio in his Toyota Tercel parked in his driveway during the afternoon. He paused as he prepared to pick up his two children, 9-year-old Alexander and 6-year-old Danielle, from school. Not wanting to forget, he had written "PU Kids" on his hand. Dave was a familiar presence at Culbertson Elementary School, where his children attended, often joining them for lunch. As an Olympic gold medalist in wrestling from the 1984 Games, Dave frequently spoke at the school about sportsmanship and the rewards of hard work. He would bring his gold medal with him and would go around placing it around the neck of each of the students he was speaking to after his talks. Around 3 p.m., a Lincoln Town car pulled up to the house. Dave called out, "Hi, Coach," to the driver. "Do you have a problem with me?" Response. Without giving Dave a chance to answer, the driver reached out his window and shot him with a revolver. Dave's wife, Nancy, had been in their living room when she heard the shot. She heard a second shot before she reached her front door. She got outside just in time to see her husband be shot for a third time as he lay prone on the ground. The gunman pointed his gun at Nancy, so she ducked back inside and called 911. The gunman sped off, and Nancy ran back outside to Dave. When she turned him back over, Dave was still breathing, and she kissed his forehead. He stopped breathing there on the ground outside of his home. He was formally declared dead after he was taken to Mercy Haverford Hospital just after 3:30. Dave was just 36 years old. The man who shot Dave was 57-year-old John Eleuthère DuPont, the great-great-grandson of Eleuthère Irénée DuPont, the founder of what had been a gunpowder mill but expanded into one of the largest chemical companies in the world. E.I. DuPont d'Estimores and Company eventually developed numerous widely used polymers such as Lycra, neoprene, and Teflon. The DuPonts were one of America's wealthiest and most well-known families. In 1987, John's personal net worth was estimated to be around $200 million. John was raised at Lasseter Hall, a massive mansion built on 600 acres of land purchased by his maternal grandfather as a wedding present for John's parents. John's paternal grandfather had built the mansion for them and modeled it after Montpelier, the home of President James Madison, which he himself had acquired in 1901. Lasseter Hall Farm, as the entire estate would be known, acquired more property over the years, eventually encompassing more than 800 acres in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, west of Philadelphia. John's upbringing was one of extreme privilege, but also one of extreme isolation and little socialization. His parents divorced when he was just a toddler, and his father had little to do with John after he remarried. John told friends that he had to make an appointment to see his father, and told the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1986 that he had spent his life searching for a father figure. John was much younger than his siblings, who had all married and moved out of the family home by the time he was school-aged, and he interacted mainly with his mother and their domestic servants. He ate meals in his room with a maid until he was 13. John was educated at the Haverford School, where he was voted both laziest and most likely to succeed. He enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania after his 1957 graduation from the Haverford School. However, he left before finishing his first year of study. He then went on to the University of Miami, where he earned a degree in marine biology. By this time, John had become obsessed with the idea of competing at the Olympics in swimming. While he was a strong enough swimmer to make the varsity swimming team in college, he was by no means skilled enough to go to the Olympics. He was eventually advised that his best chance of competing in the games would be to try to qualify in the modern pentathlon, which consists of running, swimming, shooting, fencing, and horseback riding. He had a 15-meter pool and a shooting range installed at Lasseter Hall for his training, and commissioned a mosaic showing him competing in each of the 5 events made out of tiles imported from Italy. John found some measure of success as a pentathlete, placing first in the Australian Championship in 1965. However, when he sought to qualify for the 1968 Olympics, he came in second to last at the trials. Thanks to his financial contributions to the sport, he remained involved in the community though, and was made the manager of the 1976 Olympic pentathlon team. John was similarly able to use his financial resources to insert himself into the athletics program at Villanova University. He offered the university $5 million to be used to wrestling program. The arena would have to be named after him, and he would need to be the new wrestling team's head coach. The DuPont Pavilion opened in 1986, and John was allowed to run the new wrestling program. The program only survived for 2 seasons, however. John would allow the students on the team to stay at his estate and would fly them on his private jet. The university was concerned that this behavior could be viewed as a violation of the National Collegiate Athletic Association regulations about paying or giving gifts to student athletes, which could endanger their entire athletic program. Furthermore, John's management of the team and his relationships with the coaching staff have become problematic. The clearest example of this came in December of 1988, when John was sued by one of his former assistant coaches at Villanova, Andre Metzger. Andre alleged in the suit that he had been fired from his position after he refused John DuPont's sexual advances. He claimed that in March, John had asked him to leave his wife and children to move in with him, offering to give Andre's wife the home they had been living in and large sums of money in exchange. Andre refused and was fired 2 months later. Jean claimed that he had fired Andre because he had discouraged 2 very promising high school wrestlers from attending Villanova. Both of the students said that Andre had done no such thing. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court. 1988 was not only a year of upheaval for John because of the end of the wrestling program at Villanova, but because his mother, Jean, passed away that same year. He and his mother had been exceptionally close, and she was the only relative who was really a part of his life. Jean's death left a void in John's life, but it also freed him to fill that void by becoming more involved with wrestling. Jean had not approved of her son's interest in sport, viewing it as an activity for ruffians, not men of high society like her son. Despite his disappointment with the failure of the Villanova program, John remained passionate about wrestling, and his involvement in the sport only increased in the absence of his disapproving mother. Following his death, John changed the name of the family estate from Lecceter Hall Farms to Foxcatcher Farm in honor of the stables his father had owned in the 1920s. He had previously sponsored swimmers and pentathletes to train at the estate, but those were minor efforts compared to the investment he made in wrestling. He built a state-of-the-art 14,000-square-foot wrestling training center, the Foxcatcher National Training Center, on his property and created a private wrestling club, Team Foxcatcher, that ultimately brought many of the most talented wrestlers of the time to Pennsylvania. In the late 1980s, the American wrestling program consistently lagged behind that of the Soviet Union. Wrestlers there had far more support than their counterparts in the United States, making it possible for them to have careers and dedicate more time to their training. While there were American wrestlers who did win international tournaments and Olympic medals, they normally could only remain active in the sport for a few years before financial considerations forced them to focus on careers rather than continuing their training. As such, at any given time, there were far fewer high-level wrestlers in America compared to the Soviet Union. John DuPont planned to use his wealth in his new private training center to change that. Between 1987 and 1995, he gave more than $3 million to USA Wrestling, the sport's governing national agency in the United States. He paid the wrestlers who came to train at his facility and be a part of Team Foxcatcher a stipend of up to $1,000 a month, and offered year-round housing to several of them in the smaller houses on his estate. The early days of Team Foxcatcher have been described as a sports utopia. Wrestlers trained and worked as coaches, able to focus on the sport they loved, free of the financial considerations that restricted them. John DuPont became close with several of the wrestlers and their families. He flew with the team to tournaments on his private jet. The wrestlers who trained at Foxcatcher did always think that something was not quite right with John DuPont, however. In the beginning, he seemed to just be eccentric, and his behavior was seen as odd but amusing. As the years passed, however, his behavior became more and more concerning. He went from being just a strange character to a man who displayed an unusual amount of paranoia. Eventually, his actions seemed to be motivated by complete delusions. John thought that there were mechanical trees that traveled around his estate, and he installed barbed wire in his walls because he believed intruders were moving inside of them. He argued that tooth marks left by horses in his barn were in fact messages from Martians. He had a large section of his property excavated, trying to find secret tunnels he was sure ran under his mansion. He started casually carrying firearms around the farm, out of fear that he being preyed upon. He became obsessed with the idea that the farm had been infiltrated with spies working against him. John shot the geese living in a pond on his property because he claimed they had been casting spells on him. He ordered the removal of the treadmills in the training facility because he thought the timing devices inside of them were sending him backwards through time. John eventually developed an irrational dislike of the color black because of its association with death. He forbade people working on the farm from wearing black clothing, made wrestlers get rid of their black vehicles, and sold all of his black horses. Eventually, he felt the need to rid Foxcatcher Farm of black people as well, expelling the African-American wrestlers from his program. One of these wrestlers was Kevin Jackson, who had just won a gold medal at the most recent Olympics and trained part-time at a facility on Foxcatcher Farm. As DuPont became increasingly delusional and paranoid, the wrestlers who made up Team Foxcatcher had an increasingly difficult time interacting with him, and several of them raised concerns about their safety at the farm. One of the few wrestlers who remained loyal to John and was willing to mediate the conflicts his increasingly troublesome behavior inevitably created was Dave Schultz. Dave's continued commitment to John and to Team Foxcatcher was important in part because his talent as a wrestler and as a coach was what drew many wrestlers to the program. More importantly, he was highly respected amongst wrestlers as a man, not just as an athlete. Relationships were highly important to Dave, and he cultivated them around the world with men he was supposed to view as rivals. Five-time world champion Bruce Baumgartner described Dave as the man who spoke 50 words in 50 languages because he made every effort to try to communicate with those he met at the various international tournaments he attended throughout his career. Dave also became fluent in Russian. He had initially begun learning the language so he could try to overhear advice from Russian coaches, considered to be the top in their field. While Russian-speaking wrestlers were some of Dave's stiffest competition on the international circuit, he had a great deal of respect for them. Rather than viewing them as rivals, he viewed them as fellow sportsmen who shared his passion for wrestling. Dave's ability to make friends from around the world played a role in one of the potential motives that has been suggested for his murder. Dave was very close friends with Valentin Ordunov, a Bulgarian wrestler who came to Foxcatcher Farm in 1990. Valentin and his family shared the house on Foxcatcher Farm. Dave would ultimately be killed outside of with the Schultz family. Dave having a good relationship with another wrestler would not normally be a cause of concern for any reason, but John DuPont had developed a fixation on Valentin. John became convinced that he was, in fact, of Bulgarian descent despite having a well-documented family tree that said otherwise. He claimed that their shared Bulgarian heritage gave him and Valentin a special relationship. He may have viewed Dave's friendship with Valentin as a threat to his perceived unique relationship with him. Ultimately, we do not know the exact motive behind John DuPont murdering one of his star athletes and most loyal coaches. John may have viewed Dave's efforts to keep the peace as efforts against him. By late 1995, John's behavior had become even more erratic, and Dave had to work harder to mediate conflicts on the farm. These actions, while technically done to help John, could have been construed by John's increasingly paranoid mind as Dave plotting him. Dave was an honest man who would not lie to John to reinforce his delusions. By not blindly agreeing with whatever John said or thought, Dave may have made himself out to be an adversary in John's mind. The worse John's behavior became, the more Dave had to work to keep the peace, and the more John may have thought he was being attacked. The more Dave did to help John, the more John viewed him as an enemy. Some of John's past eccentric behavior had a violent undertone. He drove around the farm in an armored vehicle. He made jokes about violence, and he eventually began carrying firearms around with him during day-to-day activities. Some of the wrestlers on Team Foxcatcher were becoming concerned for their safety. Several events in the final months of 1995 indicated that John may have in fact been becoming truly dangerous and may have played a part in John's decision to kill Dave Schultz. One day in October of 1995, wrestler Dan Shade was lifting weights in the training center when John DuPont came in with a machine gun. John pressed the gun into Dan's chest and told him to get off his farm. Dan was able to talk John down and get out of the confrontation unharmed. He did call the Newtown Square police about the incident, but the officer he spoke with's response was to simply say, "Well, I've known John a long time. He's always been a little different." John did have a long-standing relationship with the Newtown Square Police Department, even serving as a volunteer with them in the 1970s. He had donated radios and bulletproof vests to them and allowed them to use his shooting range. His involvement with the department had decreased as his involvement with wrestling increased, but police officers continued to hunt on Foxcatcher Farm every year. Police took no action about the incident in the weight room, but would later claim that this was not because of John DuPont's relationship with the department, but because Dan Shade had just spoken with an officer and not filed a formal police report. Dave Schultz became involved in the situation after he allowed Dan to park his van outside his house while Dan made preparations to move. This angered John, who seems to have believed that Dave was taking Dan's side over his. John later showed up at the Schultz home, visibly intoxicated and carrying a gun. Reports of John abusing alcohol and cocaine go back to at least the 1980s, and the substances were tied to other threats and acts of violence allegedly made by John. In the years following his mother's death, his substance abuse reportedly increased. He may have started abusing pills in addition to the cocaine, and he would regularly show up to events with alcohol on his breath. John did not injure anyone other than himself that night because he toppled over and hit his head shortly after arriving at the house. Dave and Nancy called a doctor who tended to John's injuries. The following day, someone made a passing comment to John about how he looked like he had been hit in the head with a baseball bat when they saw his injury from the fall. John then decided that he had sustained the wound from Dan Shade attacking him with a baseball bat rather than from him falling over drunk. He called the Newtown Square Police Department to file charges against Dan, and they responded to the farm. Dave Schultz had to explain to the police what had actually happened that night and assure them that Dan Shade had not even been present, much less involved, in the incident. Dave's statement to police, in which he recounts the version of events that occurred in reality rather than in the version John DuPont declared to be true, was included in the police file about the incident that John obtained from the Newtown Square Police Department. Before he left Foxcatcher Farm, Dan Shade warned Dave that he needed to leave as well because he and his family were not safe there. Dave still felt as though John would not actually physically harm anyone. Even his dedication to John was starting to wane, however. Dave hoped to make it to the 1996 Olympics, and so he remained at Foxcatcher Farm to train and coach other wrestlers who were preparing for the Olympic trials. He had decided to leave Team Foxcatcher after the Olympic Games, however. He was going to take his family back to his hometown of Palo Alto, California, where he had accepted a coaching job at Stanford. Dave reportedly told John of his plans to leave Foxcatcher Farm and return to California a few days prior to his murder. John's delusional mind may have viewed Dave's decision to leave as an attack against him and his program, combined with his perception that Dave was working against him, which had been reinforced by Dave's role in his feud with Dan Shade. This decision may have justified killing Dave in John's paranoid mind. After shooting Dave, John drove back to his mansion and retreated inside. Law enforcement was quick to respond to the farm, but they could not quickly apprehend John DuPont. The Newtown Square Police Department knew that a portion of mansion had been reinforced as an impenetrable safe room during the Cold War and that John kept firearms inside the home. There were also concerns based on John's increasing paranoia that he had booby-trapped parts of the mansion. More than 75 law enforcement professionals, including 30 members of the SWAT team, were outside of the mansion for a standoff that dragged on for 2 days. They were able to communicate John over the phone at times, and during those conversations, he referred to himself as the Dalai Lama and ordered everyone off of his holy land. He spoke to his attorney several times but refused to surrender to police. The heat was cut off to the mansion in an effort to get John to come out. John did not appear to understand that his heat was turned off intentionally. On January 28th, he asked over the phone to be allowed to go outside to try to fix his boilers, which were not inside the main house. The authorities agreed, and after John walked outside, he was apprehended and taken into custody. He was dressed in a sweatshirt bearing Bulgarian flags. Why exactly John DuPont decided to kill Dave Schultz that day is not known. What we do know is that John DuPont shot Dave Schultz in front of 2 witnesses, Nancy Schultz and John's own security consultant, who had been in the car with John when he fired all 3 shots. He had been unaware of John's plans when they got into the car that afternoon. As such, John's defense team did not try to dispute the events of January 26, 1996, or try to argue that he had not shot Dave Schultz. They did argue, however, that John was not guilty of murder. John went to trial for Dave's murder on January 21, 1997, almost exactly a year after Dave's murder, after his lawyers entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity to the charge. John had initially been found incompetent to stand trial in September of 1996 and sent for treatment of paranoid schizophrenia at Norristown State Hospital. In December of 1996, after John had undergone 2 months of treatment with antipsychotic drugs, the decision was reversed and he was found competent to stand trial. Given John's long history of bizarre and delusional behavior, which was witnessed by dozens of people, it would be easy to write him off as insane. The defense called present and former employees of Foxcatcher Farm to testify about all of the paranoid and seemingly irrational actions of John's that they had witnessed over the years. They also called 4 psychiatrists at the trial who supported the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. However, legally, suffering from a mental health condition does not automatically mean that a person is insane or absolve them of culpability for their actions. While John's lawyers presented overwhelming evidence supporting the notion that John was mentally ill, their legal obligation was to prove that he was insane. In order to prove that, they would have to demonstrate that John did not understand killing Dave was wrong at the moment he shot him. The defense's argument was that John held the irrational belief that Dave was part of an international conspiracy working against him, and that he was justified in killing him because it was an act of self-defense. The prosecution, however, while acknowledging that John DuPont was clearly suffering from mental illness, also held that he did understand that shooting Dave Schultz was wrong. He did not commit the murder because he was afraid of Dave. He committed it because he was growing resentful of him. He was guilty of first-degree murder because the crime was premeditated. The 2 psychiatrists who testified for the prosecution agreed that DuPont was mentally ill, but that he understood that killing Dave was wrong. Prosecutors also pointed to John's actions after he committed the murder to show that he knew what he had done was wrong. They claimed that the fact that John would not surrender to police and asked for his lawyer over 100 times during the 2-day standoff showed that he could comprehend that shooting Dave was wrong. The jury deliberated for 7 days after hearing weeks of testimony. As the days went by without a verdict, concerns that the trial would end in a hung jury increased. The jurors had returned to the courtroom 3 separate times to have their instructions repeated to them over the course of those 7 days. They appear to be having trouble determining the differences between the 3 possible verdicts they could return if they rejected the defense: first-degree murder, third-degree murder, or voluntary manslaughter. On the 7th day of deliberations, the jurors could be heard yelling at each other from outside the room where they were deliberating. However, they were able to come to a final decision later that day. At 5:09 p.m. on February 25, 1997, the jury announced their verdict. They found John DuPont guilty of third-degree murder but mentally ill. Their finding that he was mentally ill meant that they had rejected the defense's claim that John was legally insane at the time of the murder and still held him legally responsible for it, but allowed the judge to make a determination as to whether John should continue to be held at a psychiatric facility. While he awaited his sentencing, the defense vowed to the maximum sentence allowed of 40 years in prison. John DuPont was ultimately sentenced to 13 to 30 years in prison. His lawyers filed multiple unsuccessful appeals after his conviction. On the morning of December 9, 2010, John was found he had been suffering from severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. He was 72. In accordance with the instructions in his will, he was buried in his red Foxcatcher wrestling singlet. John's will, written 3 months before his death, left 80% of his estate to Valentin Yordanov, his wife, and various members of their family. Several of John's nieces and nephews filed various legal challenges to the will, arguing their uncle had not been of sound mind when the will was created and that Wellington and his family had exerted undue influence over him during their visits with him. The legal battle went on for 2 years. The will was upheld, with a judge arguing that the relatives who were challenging the will had not been harmed by its enforcement as they had not been named in the 5 previous iterations of John's will either. Foxcatcher Farm was sold off in several sections. 400 acres of it, including the site of the 90-year-old family mansion, was sold to a real estate developer. It is currently being developed into a luxury community named Lecedar in honor of the original name of the farm. 449 new luxury townhomes and houses are planned for the property. The mansion was torn down in 2013. The only major structure remaining from Foxcatcher Farms is an old barn which was refurbished and turned into the community's clubhouse. 2 months after Dave's murder, Nancy Schultz established the Dave Schultz Wrestling Club. The club sponsored 20 former Foxcatcher wrestlers training for the 1996 Olympics who no longer wanted to be financially dependent on John DuPont. The club supported wrestlers and their training until 2005. Nancy also worked with USA Wrestling to establish the Dave Schultz Memorial International Tournament, which is held at the United States Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, Colorado every year and keeps alive Dave's legacy of athletic excellence, as well as his dedication to sportsmanship and friendship, not limited by differences in languages or nationalities. Gertrude Tompkins was born in 1912 in Jersey City and grew up in Summit, New Jersey, in Union County, as the youngest of 3 daughters. Her father, an inventor who later found success in the cement industry, supported his daughters, Margaret, Elizabeth, and Gertrude, in pursuing a wide range of educational and life experiences. Despite Gertrude's stutter, her parents were unable to find a therapy to cure it. She raised goats for a time, received an undergraduate degree in horticulture in Pennsylvania, and toured gardens throughout Europe. Gertrude was fluent in Italian and French, and was somehow able to speak both languages without her stutter. Gertrude eventually developed a passion for flying through a pilot she fell in love with in 1940. It was unusual at the time for women to be pilots, but the young man began teaching Gertrude how to fly when she would go flying with him, and she eventually obtained her pilot's license. The couple became engaged, but Gertrude's fiancé joined the Royal Air Force so as to fight in World War II before the United States entered it. He was killed when his plane was shot down over the English Channel. The death of her fiancé instilled a desire to help with the war effort in Gertrude. In September of 1942, a seemingly perfect opportunity arose for her to do so. As male pilots were being sent overseas, there was a shortage of them for military operations stateside. Therefore, the United States government began recruiting for Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP for short, program. The aim of the program was to use civilian female pilots for tasks like military aircraft transport and testing so that male pilots could be sent into combat. Over 25,000 women applied for the program, and only 1,800 were accepted. Gertrude was one of them. Out of those 1,800, only 1,100 successfully completed the program's rigorous training. Gertrude's stutter should have caused her to fail her training, as clear communication was of paramount importance. She overcame that problem by singing her responses and commands over the radio. Like when she spoke a foreign language, she did not stutter when she sang. Gertrude finally overcame her stutter for good shortly thereafter, supposedly as soon as she flew a P-51D for the first time. She was one of only 126 members of her training class selected to fly fighter planes and attend advanced pursuit school in Brownsville, Texas. While she was initially assigned to fly the P-51D, she ultimately had the experience of flying a variety of fighter planes. On September 25, 1944, Gertrude married Henry Silver, a businessman from New York who was serving in the Army. 2 days later, she returned to her assignment in California, where she did not disclose her marriage. The women in the program were preferred to be unmarried. Gertrude may have decided to get married when she did because Henry Silver was petitioning to adopt his orphan niece at the time. He and Gertrude planned to make a home for the little girl at the end of the war. Gertrude did not discuss her marriage, use her married name, or wear her wedding ring in California. On October 26, 1944, at approximately 4 p.m., Gertrude took off from Mines Field, now a part of Los Angeles International Airport, piloting a brand new P-51D Mustang. She was to fly the plane to Newark, New Jersey. From there, the plane was going to be sent overseas. Gertrude was one of 40 pilots transporting planes that day. Gertrude, as well as 2 of the other pilots, were delayed due to problems with the canopies of their planes. Their flights for the day had to be cut short due to the delay, so they would just be flying to Palm Springs, California on this leg of the trip. Gertrude was the last to take off. She did not arrive in Palm Springs, but the other pilots assumed that there had been a further problem with her canopy and that she had gone back to Mines Field. The trip to Newark would have taken 3 days with numerous stops in perfect weather and under perfect conditions in the P-51D Mustang, particularly in light of the initial problem with the plane's canopy. No one was surprised when Gertrude did not arrive in Newark after just 3 days. After 5 days, however, officials realized that she was missing. Since Gertrude never arrived at any other airport after taking off from Mines Field, it was assumed that she crashed shortly after her takeoff from there. The search for the site of her presumed crash has therefore largely focused on the Santa Monica Bay, just west of Mines Field. The military launched a search that lasted for a month, but no sign of Gertrude or her plane was ever found. Searches for Gertrude's plane have continued over the 1 and 2004. In October of 2009, a massive underwater search was conducted by a group of 35 experts who volunteered their services. They were particularly hopeful that this search would finally solve the mystery of Gertrude's appearance, so that they could finally provide answers to Gertrude's sister, Elizabeth Tompkins Whitall, who was 100 years old and living in Florida. Gertrude's plane was not found during the course of the week-long search. The search did, however, locate the wreckage of a T-33, a jet that went missing in 1955, finally providing answers to the families of the 2 pilots who had been on board, Air Force Lieutenants Richard Martin Teeler and Paul Dale Smith. Elizabeth Tompkins Whitall passed away in 2010 at the age of 101. The Women Air Force Service Pilots program was ended in December of 1944 as more male pilots were available for the tasks it had undertaken. The women who flew as pilots during it were not considered to be part of the armed forces and therefore were not entitled to any of the benefits or honors given to veterans. In the 1970s, many of them lobbied Congress for recognition of their service, and President Obama signed a bill awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to the Women Air Force Service Pilots. Gertrude's presumably crashed plane has never been located, and her disappearance remains unsolved. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.